Night and fighting with some of the curlers downtown to try and get a parking spot. It's a big curling week for Guelph. My name's Ken Irvin. I'm the education coordinator at Guelph Museums, and I'd also like to thank the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada for their partnership in our series. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that this place we call Guelph has served as traditional lands and a place of refuge for many peoples over time, but more specifically, the Attawadra and the Haudenosaunee. This land is held as the treaty lands and territory with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. Guelph lies directly adjacent to the Haldeman Tract and is part of a long-established traditional hunting ground for the Six Nations of the Grand River. Many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who have come from across Turtle Island call Guelph home today. Guelph Museums continues to build our knowledge and relationships about the land, its history, and its peoples, and this commitment informs all that we do at Guelph Museums. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Aly. I was lucky enough to hear her speak last year, and I was so impressed by the talk that I said, "You got to come over here." So it was really wonderful. So I'm looking forward to the expanded version of your talk tonight. So Aly is a master's student at Wilfrid Laurier University. She's earned a bachelor's degree in history from Laurier, and her research focuses on drag performance, sexuality, morality, and diverse masculinities in the Canadian Expeditionary Forces during the First World War. Aly also has significant experience working as an archivist and presenter in museums, and along with their current project, which focuses on queer and disability histories in 20th century Canada. So I'm going to turn it over to you. And just to mention, we're trying to figure out if this is a great night for the lecture, so we're doing a little survey. So there are survey sheets just outside the room. So if you could take your time at the end of the night just to fill it out and let us know your response. Okay? And thank you for coming out.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you to Ken and the Guelph Museums for having me, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight to listen to me talk on masculinity in the First World War. So, masculine virility has been taken up as kind of this de facto depiction of men at war. Most commonly, we see that through modern cinema, as we can see, especially through some of the more masculine American war movies. Men who fall short of this ideal of strength and valor are painted as weak and feminine, and thus demonized for their failure to uphold gendered norms of Victorian stoicism that has continued into the period of the First World War. This view of war and gender does not allow for a representation of queer spaces in the trenches. Queerness becomes something that is othered and demonized as an opponent to the values and morale of the military. However, queer identities in queer spaces during the war are actually much more highly complex. The war created a space where queerness was both celebrated and condemned, this dichotomy existing along a delicate line of what I see as supporting the troops. My goal this evening is to walk everyone along this fine line and to demystify these queer spaces in the face of a highly masculine interpretation and conception of the First World War. So first, I want to start off by talking about Private Frederick Hardy. Hardy was a young, ambitious 16-year-old boy looking to enlist in the war and leave his life as a farmhand in Brandon, Manitoba. Hardy was only one of countless young men who lied about their age so they could go to war. Hardy stands out as a buried story of queer experience in the First World War, because of how at age 17, he was forced to represent himself in court for his queerness, showcasing a struggle of not only homophobia, but also class struggle. Frederick Lee Hardy was born on November 17, 1898, in Strathroy, Ontario. This is impossible to discern from his attestation papers alone. Having enlisted twice and being re-enlisted after serving his sentence, his records provide multiple fake birth dates, ranging from November 17, 1894, 1895, and 1896. So, as those of you in the room who may or may not study the military know, and soldiers know, sometimes it can be a little hard to discern from these records alone some information. So in order to find Hardy's most likely date of birth, that included also digging through census records from both Brandon and Strathroy, confirming that he was most likely born in 1898. So it's unclear as to why but records indicate he converted from the Salvation Army Church to the Baptist Church sometime after his family moved to Brandon. His conversion could possibly have been simply a shift in the family's belief, or it could be a result of moving halfway across the country from Ontario to Manitoba. So Hardy first enlisted on December 21st, 1914. At this time, he was apparently 18 years of age. After a medical examination, he was discharged for inefficiency. There was no indication as to why this happened in the records. He re-enlisted on March 19, 1915, and was sent overseas with the 44th Battalion. His medical examination at Shorncliffe on July 16, 1915, stated that now he was apparently 20 years of age. And now he was subsequently declared fit for duty and was taken on strength with the 44th Battalion. Shortly after which, on July 16, 1915, he was transferred to the 8th Battalion. However, on Friday, July 7, 1916, Hardy's life would be changed. He spent the evening with fellow soldier Albert Goulet, a man originally from Ohio who enlisted in the 4th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces in 1914. The two were caught by a farmer in a tulip field in Abil, Belgium, engaging in multiple sexual acts, and they were both subsequently arrested and tried. The witness statements have left nothing to the imagination, cruelly detailing every part of Hardy's sexual encounter. A teenager simply looking to explore his identity in a harmless manner was thus put on trial, having all the details of his private life documented permanently and branding him as a criminal. Hardy was responsible for representing himself. As a farmhand from Brandon, Manitoba, who had dropped out of school prematurely to help his family, he didn't really have the same level of education as those he was being tried against. On trial, he was stripped of his dignity and berated under an oppressive system of military homophobia. Not even an adult yet, he was degraded in front of multiple officials who were given every intimate detail of what he had done in that tulip field, leaving him vulnerable when he was already meant to construct his own defense against the court. Hardy's case represents the buried history of queer advocacy and class issues within the First World War. There is no indication that Hardy wanted to be an advocate. He pleaded not guilty, an attempt to save himself from a cruel fate, but the military labeled him a deviant regardless. After the trial, both Goulet and Hardy were found guilty. Hardy was tried and convicted on July 10th for, quote, committing a civil offense, committing an act of gross indecency with another male person. The Camp Commandant Canadian Corps sentenced him to 3 years of penal servitude. He was sent to Winchester Prison, which Sarah Worthman, an influential historian of queer oppression and criminalization in the Canadian Expeditionary Forces, describes as prioritizing the dehumanization of the individual in any way possible. Hardy served his sentence for the simple act of expressing human emotions. Many other men serving their sentences here may have committed crimes as violent as murder, but due to the heteronormative standards of the time, being queer was seen as a heinous crime itself, leading to the belief that he should have shared a space in prison with people who committed grander crimes. Venereal disease was also a big fear at the time for officers. However, for many officers, this led up to only a slap on the wrist for forms of heterosexual misconduct. But because Hardy engaged in intercourse with another man, it was no longer discipline over the risk of VD, but elevated to a crime. So, eventually his sentence was reduced to 18 months of imprisonment with hard labor. He was discharged and drafted into the 8th Battalion on May 12, 1917, only months before he would be killed on the front. He was killed in action August 15th in Rouen. His body was never recovered. As you can see in the photo on the right here, his name was memorialized on the Vimy Ridge Monument, an acknowledgement of the heroism he displayed in the war. Although condemned as a criminal in his files, he is still documented as a hero here on Vimy Ridge. And also, he was immortalized in the words of Reverend A.F. Newcomb. So Newcomb of the First Baptist Church in Brandon. He made a sermon for Hardy on September 9th, 1917, after his death. To quote Newcomb, Hardy was remembered as one of the defenders of our nation and a fallen hero and brave comrade. Hardy, a young teenager from rural Ontario, a farmhand made to defend himself in court for something that should have never been deemed a crime in the first place, still stands in the eyes and accounts of those in Brandon, Manitoba, as a hero. Moreover, with new research into court-martial records, a new queer microhistory of heroism is being unearthed. A story that has long been understudied and thus underrepresented. In the dearth of stories and accounts, Hardy's life shows how much queer history exists and is waiting to be revealed and subsequently brought to life. Now, I do want to change pace a bit, because I know many of us who study queer history are aware of these grim realities, but I want to show that this was not the only reality for queer people in the war. So during the First World War, gender and sexuality were subject to the enduring moral values of the Victorian period. So the two fronts, the trenches and the home front, were separated between masculinity and femininity, creating an expectation of how men and women should have behaved. The men's sphere of the trenches created an environment that expected them to demonstrate masculine traits of valor, honor, and bravery, all the while adhering to this Victorian ideal of stoicism. Victorian gender idealism can also be linked to masculine virility and Judith Butler's heterosexual matrix. Basically, the heterosexual matrix is this idea that ties biological sex to compulsory heterosexuality, and it operates under an assumption that everyone must align with the gender norms of masculinity or femininity, which has been perpetuated through societal expectations of sexual reproduction. However, patriotism also had a very strong influence on Canadian society during the war, which also impacted how flexible gender and sexuality became. This clash between morality and patriotic duty in Canada during the First World War allowed both men and women to experiment with different gender roles that also went against the grain of these societal pressures. Patriotic duty and shared experiences of violence and death acted as a normalizing force for close male-male bonds that were previously inaccessible in the pre-war period. Another important aspect of queer spaces formed during the war came from female impersonation, or what we modernly refer to as drag. A prime example of this is the concert troupe, the Dumbells. They were formed by eight Canadian soldiers during the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917. The story goes they were given 1 week to put on a show that could majorly improve fading morale during Passchendaele. So a subsect of the group also began in Mons during the summer of 1917. So for those of you wondering where the name the Dumbells came from, it actually comes from the patch of the 3rd Division, so which features a little red dumbbell on a little blue background. The Dumbells' most famous female impersonator, Ross Hamilton, or Marjorie, as you can see here on the left, was born in Pugwash, Nova Scotia in 1889. He enlisted in Montreal in 1916 in the 9th Field Ambulance Corps, where he served as an ambulance driver. Hamilton was innovative in his performances in a heavy context of material scarcity during the First World War. He created his costumes utilizing old curtains, tent canvases, rosary beads, and pillow feathers. So, beyond drag, the war also did normalize some form of affection between individuals of the same sex due to the nature of the war and patriotic duty. War acted as a normalizing force for close bonds to form in a shared experience of violence and death, when there was a lack of the opposite sex to seek comfort in. Canadian men in the trenches were given new avenues to explore their emotional side, which was in direct violation of the tough exterior they were expected to show based on these Victorian ideals and sensibilities. Trench culture meant men were under constant bombardment and had no idea when they might die. Images from the trenches, as you can see here, showcase moments where men were more vulnerable. Photographs display men spooning, quote unquote, as they rested together in the trenches. In these conditions, close bonds, both romantic and platonic, naturally formed out of the need to feel connected to humanity in the face of death and violence. The intense conditions of the front rewrote Victorian values of men not being allowed to show too much emotion to close friends, instead allowing for men to be more openly emotional and vulnerable, and temporarily abandoning reserving emotions that was originally just meant to be saved for heterosexual marriages. When returning to civilian society, these close homosocial bonds were seen to undermine masculinity. It was expected that upon their return from the war, men would place greater emphasis on heterosexual marriages and domestic ties instead of the friendships they had formed during the war. Society's moral expectations of these men when they returned to Canada displays the war's ability to open small windows of opportunity to challenge pre-existing societal behaviors and rewrite them. The trenches allowed men to challenge the idea of being masculine and suppressing emotions, and allowed them to fully express their feelings, both romantic and platonic, to their friends in a way that society would not allow before. However, not only was drag or the trenches places for this, but also hospital settings were very important for allowing men to defy this idea of like masculine toughness. Hospitals created atmospheres for intimacy between fellow men that did not previously exist on the home front. The hospital was a setting where men came after an experience of trauma, whether to the mind, the body, or both. It also stood as a direct challenge to masculinity itself. Men who were diagnosed with hysteria or declared disabled were subjected to being feminized by the culture surrounding them. The hospital became a site for the formation of deeper bonds between men, as those who inhabited these locations had seen death firsthand and needed an outlet to cope with the trauma. Some of these close bonds led observing nurses to describe these couples as couples, with photographic evidence existing of some of these men holding hands or sharing a bed together. This level of intimacy between men would have been seen as immoral outside of a war context. However, they were able to challenge the gender norms of masculinity and the absence of intimacy with their relationships due to the intense trauma of the war. Men not only played literal drag roles in these situations, but they also played a form of what I call emotional drag, as they entered homosocial relationships that would be heavily scrutinized in a non-military medical context. The hospital offered a reprieve from battlefield masculinities, where men could form relationships that imitated male-female relationships. Trauma opened an avenue for men to explore new gender roles, as they were already being feminized by society at large. Distance and violence clashed with Victorian moralism to create an ideal environment for men to fully express emotions, and trauma seen as feminine because they did not fit into this box of stoic male characteristics that was emphasized in both the pre-war period and the post-war period. Further, masculinity is also challenged in hospital settings, as there was a clash between forming intimate relationships and the belief that men needed to recover quickly so they could return to the front and thus regain their masculinity. The hospital represented a physical space where men could take a break from masculine expectations of being violent and aggressive. The pity and the hesitancy to decommission soldiers based on injury reflects the attitudes of masculinity at the time, where they are viewed as being physically disconnected from their masculinity when they could not return to battle. These hospital spaces were a place for men to perform a role outside of expectations. They were allowed to be vulnerable and emotionally attached to each other versus cold beings in an environment cast in the shadow of death. The longer a man spent convalescing at a hospital, the longer they spent disconnected from this military masculinity. which meant they were spending longer playing a role that went against societal norms. Unlike those performing a form of femininity for troop entertainment, viewed as acceptable for the patriotism it displayed, this was seen as a deviant femininity due to the disconnect from war service and patriotism. The myth of masculine military virility created an ethos where masculinity was entangled with fighting in the trenches and displaying signs of courage, which was strengthened by the mobilization in war. The failure of a man to return to the trenches led to their, quote, demasculinization, as they failed to perform their patriotic duty of protecting Canada and serving the Empire when they were stuck in a feminized hospital setting. And now, once again, to return to Ross Hamilton. The feminine or queer actions of men becomes acceptable when supporting the troops, much like Ross Hamilton and his ability to play the role of a woman in a patriotic sense. But still, he was an ambulance driver in support of the war. I don't know if anyone in the front or some of you can read this message on the bottom, but advertisements for their performance at the London Coliseum during September 1918 heavily emphasized the role they had just played on the front lines, serving 16 months, and stated they were on approved leave from the military to perform. Hamilton and the Dumbells serving on the front acted as a means to justify their feminine roles, as they still fit into their virile role of masculinity outside of their drag performances. So, on the largely masculine war front, female impersonation provided a patriotic way to explore gender diversity outside of what men were told was acceptable, to be aggressive and endure the horrors of war in the trenches with a stiff upper lip. Drag acted as a method to bring women into a male-gendered space. Since it was performed as a pantomime of femininity with the purpose of boosting morale, it was not seen as a threat to the gendered order of the military environment. And as highlighted in a 1990 interview with Jack McLaren, who was the last surviving member of the original Dumbells troupe, jokes about men in drag were actually absent from audiences at the front. Men were willing to accept the illusion of Hamilton as the embodiment of everyone's female fantasy, as McLaren puts it, to cope with the absence of wives and girlfriends who were overseas. In this context, gender was a performance acted out on stage. The art of the performance, in this essence, of the war environment allowed men to push the boundaries of gender without facing moral backlash, because it ultimately improved the attitudes of soldiers. Since these mimic behaviors still fit within a caricature of femininity, it was able to go unnoticed and continue as a way for men to explore more feminine attitudes and attributes of their gender. And now, adding to this challenge of gender idealism, cross-dressing is considered to be the most prominent aspect of homosexuality during the war in an open sense. In this era, men showing any form of effeminate behavior were connected to immorality or homosexuality, as I've just laid out with the hospital setting. As the ideals of men dominating the unemotional and aggressive public sphere had been carried on from the Victorian era during the First World War. Falling under the label of effeminate on the war front could be detrimental to a man's character. But drag offered an opportunity to safely act out feminine performances and possibly display homosexuality without being penalized for it. Although drag did reinforce gendered status quos of male and female expectations, it simultaneously showcased these elements of homoerotic desire. According to a Toronto Star interview of Dumbells member Jack Eyre from 1974, Ross Hamilton's drag character Marjorie, as you can see on the right here, was so effective that apparently, according to the story, a stagehand attempted to court her. Whether or not that's true, I don't know, but I could definitely believe it looking at some of these photos. Drag provided men the opportunity to be desired by other men by maintaining this gender role of femininity and femaleness in a pantomime. This desire was the closest men could achieve to normalize homosexuality in a public setting, as men were not seen to be desiring maleness or masculinity, but instead a stage performance of femininity. Hamilton's homoerotic desires stretched beyond the audience as well, directly to the stage. As a queer man, Hamilton's sexuality was something that had to be kept under the surface to avoid punishment in an oppressive military heteronormative system. As Marjorie, she constantly took on roles as the object of male desire within Dumbell performances, such as a nurse, as you can see on the right here, or during romantic numbers such as You Left Me Mighty Lonely, Someday I'll Make You Mine, and in wartime productions such as the revenue show Ace High. In one specific instance, the Dumbells put on a production of HMS Pinafore in 1918. Hamilton played the role of Josephine. For those of you who are unfamiliar with HMS Pinafore, Josephine is the prima donna of the show, who fell in love with an able seaman on her father's ship. By reinforcing accepted gender roles through love, desire, and heterosexual marriage, Hamilton was simultaneously allowed room to challenge masculine expectations of the wartime soldier. In performing femininity, he became a source of desire for his fellow actors and was able to display his sexuality in a way deemed acceptable by the military and public for the time. Playing into the heterosexual matrix, Hamilton perpetuated the dichotomous norms of sexuality by performing the role of a woman to normalize male desire in a rough and intolerant environment, predicated on the ideal of reproductive marriage and sex. Hamilton was able to play the role of a woman in the Dumbells due to his role's association with wartime duty. Hamilton has been described by soldiers he performed for as a bathing suit beauty and regarded as a stunning brunette knockout by the woman-hungry soldiers. His gender play displayed an element of acceptable homosexuality within the military context, as he played both the role of the desirable woman missing from the lives of men on the front, but he also served as an ambulance driver to aid the war effort. He played a dual role of carrying wounded men and performing his drag act. Jack McLaren mentions that female impersonation was an influential factor in Hamilton's shows, going so far as to state that he generated popularity with his falsetto and acting skills, which is stated to perfectly mimic that of the traditional female soprano. In one of his final interviews in 1989, McLaren claims Hamilton was the true star of the Dumbells, whereas the rest of the men were simply undistinguished. Hamilton represents a form of patriotic drag, as I like to call it, as his femininity can be taken on and off to suit what is needed for the war effort. Marjorie becomes a figure of male affection in a time where female presence is lacking, thus demonstrating how gender became fluid and borderless when justified under the realm of one's patriotic duty. So this idea of patriotism and service in the war is a key highlight in all of the Dumbells' advertising, press coverage, and programs. A press clipping describing their first performance in England at the Australian YMCA at the Aldwych in 1918 emphasized the importance of the members' service in the war, stating that all of them had participated in the fight and had the full consent of military authorities to be entertaining the soldiers through song and acting performances. Most interestingly, the article also discusses the performances of Marjorie and Marie, who was portrayed by the female impersonator Alan Murray, who you can see on the screen here. Both men are praised for their makeup skills, costuming, and ability to impersonate women. But what is truly the most significant aspect of this article is the discussion of Marjorie, as her performance of the song 1 Hour of Love is said to be a lesson to many a girl. Hamilton was not just this ideal embodiment of the female fantasy and an object of desire for men at the front. He also transcends this to become a role model for women as well. Hamilton is described to be an ideal example of femininity, and thus he is painted as a figure women should be learning how to portray their gender from, thus placing the ideal model of femininity onto a man. In this vein, patriotic vigor allowed for the challenging of normative roles, as these performances brought women to war camps where they were often absent. Audience attitudes were reported to be instantly improved with these drag performances for soldiers who had been in intense battle. The presence of women within a male-centric front allowed soldiers a glimpse of the idea of femininity that may help them connect to their own emotions surrounding their missed loved ones, like a wife or girlfriend back home. The female impersonators did not go as far to use overtly crude material either. This portrayal of respectable femininity would sell the full effect of womanhood defined by gender morality at the time. Playing within these gender norms had the ironic outcome of also allowing men to subvert military masculinity and expectations of maleness by playing a feminine role in a protected space on stage. By stepping into the feminine role, same-sex attraction was normalized, as men were attracted to the male performer instead of femininity. They were attracted to femininity instead of the male performer. As a post-war advertisement would come to state for the Dumbells, the most beautiful woman is a man. Men were allowed to play the part of feminine eroticism and beauty, challenging masculinity and military maleness into which they were supposed to fit. They were not condemned for playing the part of a woman due to the nature of the comfort and obvious solace it provided for war-torn soldiers. However, outside of these patriotic drag performances, female impersonation in civilian life was not always a profession entertainers took pride in. In a 1915 interview, female impersonator Julian Dalton claims his work to be a battle. He is very blunt as to the drawbacks of this form of entertainment, stating, managers don't want you, agents won't book you, and the critics roast you. Throughout the article, he is cynical about his career as an impersonator, constantly making remarks about his dreams to be a true entertainer. Despite Dalton's negative experiences with drag performance attitudes, drag in the context of patriotism in military service continued to be a popular and respected form of entertainment. The trenches were an environment which diverged significantly from civilian life. With the constant threat of death, expectations of a virile and stoic masculinity were challenged in any given moment, allowing for the emergence of alternative expression, or performances in the case of the Dumbells, to gender. Men could acceptably take on the feminine role to promote the continuity of a strong soldierly masculinity. The conflict between Victorian morality existing from the pre-war period and a push for individuals to perform a patriotic duty in Canada allowed men and women to explore different gender roles that opposed Victorian ideals of masculinity and femininity. Now men and women in Canada were able to play roles that had been previously stigmatized before. The war, in a sense, became a large drag show where moral values could be openly challenged under the guise of patriotic duty. Everyone had a role to play in the First World War, but these roles were an open source of conflict in daily life. The war was not just a disruption to everyday life for Edwardian Canadians, but also to the very foundations of the heterosexual matrix and reproductive sexuality, which the society was predicated on. Now, I want to take us a bit past the First World War, because I actually think this context is important to understanding the First World War itself. So, the interwar and post-war receptions of queerness during the First World War are key to understanding the overall queer spaces in society. Memory and nostalgia play a strong role in shaping these attitudes of acceptability and conviction that painted the war years. Heroism is a contentious topic. Although Hardy was celebrated as a hero and honored on Vimy, not all queer soldiers received that same memory. Hardy's memory is attached to the ideal of the ultimate sacrifice, which redeemed him in the eyes of the military, and thus erasing his queer identity in the process. However, not all queer soldiers were privy to the same praise. Some soldiers died in prison, unrecognized and criminalized, or many went on to live quiet lives, facing erasure of their identity and risked being further punished in the interwar society of hardened masculine ideals. Others, such as Goulet, struggled under a double burden, suffering psychological effects from the harrowing experiences in the trenches after already facing ridicule and condemnation from the military authorities and peers for his homosexual identity. Inversely, the Dumbells continued to share in prestige they held during the war. Much of this played off the nostalgia for their morale-boosting performances. The Dumbells continued performing in the interwar period, introducing new cast members, including women, into their shows. Hamilton still continued to make multiple appearances as Marjorie in these shows, with advertisements often utilizing language of nostalgia to draw in these audiences. In June of 1919, the Winnipeg Tribune advertised the third concert party's return to the stage at the Pavilion stage, emphasizing the return of Ross Hamilton as Marjorie, claiming her to be one of the most popular members of the Dumbells. With this, the advertisement mentions Hamilton's service in the war before taking on the role of Marjorie, always calling back to the contribution to the fight, thus justifying the acceptability of the role. So, the Dumbells were also notably the first Canadian show to play on Broadway in 1921, according to Jack Eyre. The Dumbells did not only have raving reviews from Canadian audiences, but they also dazzled American audiences in the interwar years. The Buffalo News reviewed the Dumbells' review of Ooh La La in September 1927. Hamilton was considered to be dazzling and even shocked audiences with his beautiful soprano range. Glen Allen is also mentioned as a prominent female impersonator, featured in the show with his aesthetic dancing act. The review claimed that this dance would not have been appreciated if done by a talented, skilled woman, but when performed by an impersonator, it became a remarkable performance. This review hints that the original performance may have been featured as an element of comedy and may not have been a serious ballet routine, differing from Hamilton's more serious musical performances. One very notable difference between Canadian and American receptions of the Dumbells can be seen through what reviewers praise as the highlight of the show. As I have previously shown, for most Dumbell shows with Canadians, Hamilton tends to be considered the highlight of the show. McLaren himself considering him to be the true star and thus overshadowing the rest of the troupe. Although the American reviews express great enjoyment of Hamilton's performance, but he's not stated to be the star. Instead, Red Newman's performance of Oh, It's a Lovely War is stated to be the highlight of the review. Similarly, the Buffalo Inquirer reviewed the Dumbells' 1921 review of Biff Bing Bang, where you can see Hamilton there. They state that the most important part of the show, or the highlight of the show, comes from a comedic skit entitled Kit Inspection. Hamilton also features in this review, where he is stated to have been a figure that many women would envy. This stark contrast between Canadian and American conceptions of Hamilton can also be explained by nostalgia. Since Canadian and American forces did not really intermingle during the war, American veterans would not have had the same nostalgic connection to Hamilton as a morale booster. Instead, this was the first time they were seeing his act, and thus did not share the same intimate connection that Canadian audiences had with him. And now, the same nostalgia from the 1919 review that was highlighted is also highlighted in an advertisement for Al Plunkett's 13th annual review, As You Were, in the Calgary Herald in October 1931. The article put special importance on the return to the all-male cast, stating that the girls had been eliminated from this cast in order to bring back Ross Hamilton and other favorite impersonators. This return was also stated to be a promise of continued prosperity for the Dumbells. Although 1919 and 1931 are situated in very different contexts in the post-war period, both still harbored the same play on nostalgia. In a period of rebuilding and new masculine expectations, these advertisements utilize the strong sense of nostalgia for what some veterans would consider the good parts of the war, and the parts that provided a sense of comfort to not only gain traction and support for the show, but also made a space for Hamilton and other impersonators to continue in these roles, playing out diverse forms of femininity, even when women were no longer needed to be absent. This heavy sense of nostalgia goes as far as even replacing heteronormative femininity in the Dumbells and returning it to the old homoerotic depiction of femininity from the First World War. So Hamilton also continued his drag act into the Second World War as a volunteer with the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps. His drag character became a middle-aged opera singer in line with his own age. During the period, Hamilton's sexuality was exposed. However, he did not face the same scrutiny Hardy had 20 years earlier, instead being discharged for, quote, reasons other than medical. Here is another key example of showcasing the treatment of queer soldiers during the war. Hamilton was able to play this role of femininity and queer masculinity when under the guise of morale boosting and supporting the troops. But once his sexuality came to light, he became labeled a danger to unit cohesion and thus was no longer able to defy these roles of masculinity in acceptable context. In this way, supporting morale was a key fixture, allowing these loose queer masculine roles to play out. And despite Hamilton's dismissal from the army, nostalgia still heavily influenced the way he was viewed in the years following the Second World War. In Jack Ayer's original script for an episode of CBC's On Camera Canada, entitled The Dumbells with Affection, filmed in September 1964, he has a part of a 3-page script dedicated to Hamilton as Marjorie. Once again, Ayer utilized familiar phrases from the war, claiming Marjorie to be the, quote, most beautiful lady you ever saw, and claiming that the CBC audience would have fallen in love with her too. Alongside this, Ayer also positions their shows close to Vimy Ridge, stating this is where they needed to boost morale. In a clip from the episode that aired in 1965, 2 of the surviving members recall Hamilton a year after his passing. He is remembered as a, quote, raving beauty in makeup. Unfortunately, after a quip that he was not the most attractive man. He was also referred to as a young lady that any of the soldiers could have taken home to introduce to their mothers. So nostalgia was already the basis of this CBC special, recalling the war years and the Dumbells' contribution to them, and beginning with Jack Ayer taking the audience back to 1917, where it all began. It is fascinating how much Hamilton is connected to this nostalgia. He is not just connected to it by being an excellent performer. His femininity and the male attraction directed towards him from the troops is also wrapped into this memory. The queer space Hamilton created is not divorced from memories in the war, but instead enhanced within them, even in a period defined by the nuclear heteronormative family. However, the key aspect of morale boosting is also attached to these memories. Despite Hamilton's femininity continuing to be reinforced in nostalgia, it cannot be separated from its connections and justification in boosting morale. These past few years, Hamilton's legacy has come back into consciousness. Last year, CBC News released a segment regarding a Nova Scotian campaign for Canada Post to create a commemorative stamp dedicated to Hamilton's legacy as a drag performer and pioneer of the modern drag scene. Veterans Affairs Canada has also featured Hamilton in their 2023 Veterans Week Special Edition of Canada Remembers Times, expanding their education to include serving with pride. The article highlights Hamilton's service during the war and his wrongful discharge due to his sexual identity. So, to conclude tonight, masculinity and queerness are much more diverse than it's previously been treated in popular memory. Men had the opportunity to express queer desire and become the object of that desire, much like Hamilton in the role of female impersonation. This presentation of femininity, which by other means would break the mold of expected experiences of masculinity, is actually celebrated when directly connected to the war effort and in the name of patriotic morale boosting. Despite these celebrated expressions of queer desire, however, it is crucial to remember the horrific treatment of countless queer individuals in the military at the time. Despite being a celebrated figure in Canadian war history, Hamilton died before same-sex activities were decriminalized in Canada in 1969. Further, countless others were subjected to the same punishment as Hardy and Goulet for their expression of queer desire. During the war, private and vulnerable actions became a public crime under the same regime that celebrated drag for supporting the war effort. Because of this, the First World War can be defined as a context in which men could explore their identities and express queer desire that was previously repressed by Victorian morality and stoicism. However, these desires were also dangerous and could be punished or accepted. The examination of masculinity, queerness, and gender display contradiction between state ideals and objectives during the war. Although these ideals rested on the continuation of the heterosexual matrix and the upholding of virile masculinity. However, with the state's main objective of winning the war, these values could not feasibly continue and thus clashed directly with winning the war. In order to win the war, morale was essential to their objectives. Without the inclusion of gender play and queer individuals to perform the male desire, the goals of the state would not be achievable. Moreover, those already condemned by the state for falling short of these ideals were needed in the war to secure objectives and push towards the victory at key battles. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. There's a lot of research that's gone into that. I was just wondering have you found any recordings of Ross singing?
So I finally came across this. I've been looking at this for about 3 years, but the CBC special I watched, there is clips of him singing within it. And I can confirm, I'm a huge musical theater person. I've listened to so many sopranos sing, and I can confirm the likeness is just uncanny.
Oh. Another quick question. With Hardy, like his actions were so exposed. Was that typical of all trials against people that had it?
So not always. It kind of, I think from what I understand, it kind of depends on how much they consider it to disrupt military cohesion, because the most important thing was cohesion, morale, and esprit de corps. So if you were considered to be interrupting this esprit de corps, it usually became more punishable and thus public, versus someone like Hardy, because he's been supporting morale and cohesion for so long, that's something that they'd more rather dismiss him quietly for.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, but besides Hamilton, did they generally attract kind of gay men to these groups? Or was it too hard to kind of come out, or was it between, I just wondered what percentage might?
So as far as the Canadian context, I've only really found Hamilton so far. I think it just all depends. I think genuinely, just based on the period, it all depends on how public they are. I usually use queer in this context to define the space, because there's certain people I don't know whether or not they're queer. I think it's definitely highly likely that a lot of queer men were attracted to these spaces. I don't want to say fortunately, because it is very unfortunate that he was outed. But because of outing, that's how we know Hamilton was a queer man.
And also with the spooning too, could they not even just use the excuse of keeping warm as well?
Well, this type of spooning was actually relatively not judged and was accepted, just because it was, again, the sense of keeping warm, like this kind of acceptable emotional attachment in the trenches, because that's directly in front of these horrors of the war.
There would be comfort.
Right? Exactly, yes.
Comfort in safety.
Mm-hmm.
And warmth. And warmth, of course.
There's
So my personal life after the war, going back home for somebody who would have been in whether the Dumbells or another drag performance in the war, any research on how individuals coped, or the psychology, or just dealing with any backlash with going back home, or how that affected? Just wondering if there's any research on that or studies on that.
So I think there definitely are studies on that. I'm still diving into that part myself, but I definitely think, once again, there's already on top of the issues of coping with the war as veterans and some of the psychological traumas. I think there would be some more like trauma placed on top of that, especially once again when you're expected to return to this heteronormative environment, get married, have a family.
Yeah. And deny that part, like wondering if there was like even a shame that was quieted or anything like that, or even just friendships that would have been like that part where you said that friendships were stopped after the war, and then people had to go back to their normal family life. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I just want, I know this is a Canadian group, but have you come across examples of other countries where they've had drag performances like this to support the war effort?
So from an international conference I've been to, there's a lot of talks of, especially in the German context actually, there was a lot of drag performances, but also to the British context, especially coming out of kind of the British pantomimes.
Okay. Oh, one more, yeah.
Yeah, I got one over the So I just found it so fascinating, the contrast of that 1915 piece by the civilian force and how difficult it was to be trained. And contrasting that with the radio news that wasn't getting approached. So is the war kind of like changing? Is it sort of a sea change in how the public perceives drag performance, or is it just the Dumbells themselves who have been able to, as you say, have so much nostalgia around their role and boosting around to have carve out this space that are given such
I do believe, for the most part, it is the Dumbells and nostalgia from what I've been reading in interwar newspapers. Because like outside of the Canadian context, it is very much as I've described in this presentation, the idea that the female impersonation is interesting. However, I kind of prefer the heteronormative men who are singing or the comedy skit I watched. Whereas in the Canadian context, once again, it's always connected to that nostalgia. It's, oh, Ross Hamilton, the most beautiful woman I saw during the war.
Okay, well, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you again, Aly. That was really wonderful and great having you come out on such a snowy night. Just to let you know about next month's talk on Thursday, February 20th. Dr. Douglas Hunter is going to speak on A.Y. Jackson and the Group of Seven in the Great War. He's going to explore the role of the First World War in the life and career of artist A.Y. Jackson and the war's impact on the formation of Canada's most famous art collective. So that's next month. And I've just found out we had someone who'd actually met A.Y. Jackson twice. So hopefully to see you out next month. So thank you for coming out, and please fill out the survey if you have a chance.
Thank you.